Lars Christensen, fyrrverandi aðalhagfræðingur Danske Bank, Íslendingum vel kunnugur. Hann hefur oft tjáð sig ástandið á Íslandi, var meðal annars einn þeirra sem skrifaði þekkta skýrslu efnahagsástandið fyrir Danske Bank árið 2006, skýrslu sem vakti vægast sagt ekki mikla lukku á þeim tíma. Þar var því spáð að alvarleg samdráttarskeið væri framundan á Íslandi, mikla skuldir og viðskiptahalli gengu ekki til lengdar. Hann hefur líka tjáð sig ástandið eftir hrun og meðal annars kynnt sér auðlindanýtingu þjóðarinnar. We would like to welcome Lars Christensen to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's late in the afternoon, and you are probably thinking about the cocktails we're going to have afterwards, so I will try to not make it too dull. I think this is the first presentation I will ever do, maybe the last one ever also, on fishery and economics. However, it's not something that I have not been interested in for a while, or rather have been interested in the topic of the environment and how you use market mechanisms to get good environmental outcome, essentially since I went to university in the early 90s. I actually wrote my bachelor's thesis on exactly that topic. And I'm very inspired by work by the American, or British-American, Nobel Prize winner, Ronald Coase, won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1991 for, among other things, how to use property rights in terms of what economists call externalities. And that is what I have been asked to talk about, and I want to thank the Federation for inviting me, or SFS for inviting me to do the presentation today. And I'll try to go through how I see the setup in Icelandic fishery and regulation in terms of how that plays together with nature. And so we got that here. But before we throw ourselves into this, I will tell you a little story about what happened to me yesterday. I was flying in from Copenhagen yesterday afternoon, and I put on my Facebook, I'm going to Reykjavik again. It's the second time this year I'm in Reykjavik. I'll be here at least 3 times more this year. Sorry, I can't stay away from the country. I put I will go to Reykjavik and I will talk about this topic. Immediately, a discussion on my Facebook page erupted between a number of Icelanders, having very clearly different position on the fishery thing. One even suggested that I started a revolution against you guys. I will stay out of that part, but it tells me quite a bit about how essential this is. So when we talk about other issues, I think if we took a random selection of Danes and said, how is the Danish fishing industry going? And it's like, why are you talking about this boring topic? Nobody could really get worked up about the Danish fishery industry. If you say something in Iceland about the fishery industry, I have noticed there are about 200 different views among 100 people of this issue. So I will add opinion number 201. Who owns it? This, to me, is completely essential to the discussion we have about fishery. And when I put this title, I didn't really think about how good the title is. I realized that in hindsight. The title says something about property rights and trading in quotas and stuff like that. But also the fundamental discussion we have in Iceland, and that's the discussion that erupted on my Facebook site, who really owns the fish? And I can tell you that economists have no clue about that, but I will get to that. But basically, I will try to, it's all about property rights. It's all about property rights. So what I will try to say something about is 3 things. First of all, what's the problem we are facing? Well, the problem is what economists and biologists is calling the tragedy of the commons. I'll return to that. And the solution, well, I already alluded to that, that is property rights. Um, and then the last one, and that is really where everybody would like to have a view on it, and I don't have a view, is what the optimal resource fee is, if we're going to have such a thing. We have such a thing in Iceland. I'll have some views on that topic in the end. And the journalist will be most interested in that and don't care about the economics, but I'll give you the economics. I stole this thing from a report from McKinsey from 2012 about the Icelandic economy, because I think it tells a pretty good story about what the issue is here. What it is here is we have, essentially, when we look at the Icelandic fisheries sector, we have 3 dimensions of the discussion. One dimension is the biology. How much fishery should we have to have sustainable stock of fish? The second thing is the economic model. How do we regulate the fishery sector economically? What mechanisms are working and what are not working? And then the final one is the political. And that is essentially a discussion about, it gets down to really the resource fee, or who owns the quotas. And that's a political discussion. If we're going to say what my focus will be, it will be the red box, because after all, I'm an economist. Biology is not my strong side. I'm married to a biologist, so I leave that to her. She, by the way, only eats fish, so maybe I should have sent her instead. She would be terrified in staying in front of 200 people. So we leave it to me, talking about the economics. And then the green box, the quota owners, who owns it, and the resource fee. I'll try to tell you something about that, an economics perspective of it, not, again, the economic mechanisms about it, but some of the discussions that the economists can add to that discussion. So let's start about what is the problem. Well, you all remember, I can see from the average age here, and you all remember, the overfishing in the 80s. That when we have a system where there is essentially no property rights to the fish in the sea, it's just what economists would call a common pool. Imagine when we get out afterwards and there are drinks. Is there any price on the drinks? No. How many drinks will you drink? I know that. We'll see around 10 o'clock tonight. There is no mechanism controlling how much consumption of that you have. Well, in the case of drinks and having a party tonight, it's a positive externality. We all get a little bit drunk and the party gets better. But there can be an externality that is that if I drink a drink, there is less for the rest of you. And in the case of fish, if we all go out and just take out the fish, we all know that it's in our individual interest to harvest as much fish as possible if there's no restriction on how much fish I catch. But we also know that the stock of fish will have a depletion of the fish stock if everybody is doing that. That is the overfishing. So we need to regulate that. And this, you can probably not see here, this comes back to, this is the cartoon. Instead of talking about the sea, we talk about what the British call commons. It's open land that nobody owns. So you can put your cattle in there, and they can all just eat. And there's an overconsumption of that. The tragedy of the commons term was popularized by a biologist called Garrett Harding. It actually goes back more than 150 years. It's the invention of economists. Economists, I should tell you, are more clever than biologists. Just how it is. And from talking to Danish fishers, my experience is that fishers don't like biologists, so I will always bring that up. After this, you might not like economists. What he's saying is the ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in freedom of the commons. Freedom in commons brings ruin to all. We all rush in and just grab. And we're doing that. We used to do that. And that is how fishery used to be regulated or not regulated. So how do we solve that problem? Well, traditionally we have had 4 forms of solving this problem. The first one is the traditional one. This is what we could call command and control. You can see I put Stalin up there. That is how you run a Soviet economy. You tell people how much to produce or not to produce, and if they're not doing the right thing, you send them to a concentration camp. That's how you regulate things without prices. So if there's no property rights and there's no prices, you need to have a Stalinist regime, essentially. That used to be how we regulated fishery in Iceland. Quota systems that were not tradable, that were just allocated based on some mechanism, central planning style. Say there's this much fish, this is how we do it. There was no changes in prices. The result of this is always that you get inefficiencies. It is not the most efficient ships, captains who are doing the fishing necessarily, because the allocation of quotas are done by command and control, by basically a Soviet planned economy style allocation, rather than who is willing to pay the most for the quotas. Those who are willing to pay the most for the quotas are those who can most efficiently use the quotas. And that's the property rights thing. Interestingly enough, when we started to regulate this issue in Iceland, as I'm told, the first paragraph in the law says that the quotas is not property rights. That's where the whole political discussion starts. Is it owned or is it not owned? It is not property rights in a legal sense because the law says it is not. However, in an economic sense, it is property rights because people are trading them between each other. So, in the economic mechanism, it works as if it is property rights. Probably some would also say that in historical terms, since we have been doing this for 25, 30 years, and you can use the quotas as collateral, there's some kind of legal acceptance that these are property rights. But at least in a market terms, in economic terms, it is property rights. That's not a legal concept, it's an economic concept. The other way we can regulate this is what with fees or taxes. I have been coming to this country every year, a number of times a year, for 10 years. Last week, it was 10 years ago I wrote that report that you all know. I was first time in this hotel 10 years ago. The Icelandic economy was booming, but there was not a lot of people here, other than bankers. And some politicians that said I was crazy. But now there is a lot of tourists. The natural resources of Iceland is a common pool. I can just go out in the countryside and use the countryside without paying for it. I have free access to using the environment everywhere. What is the result of that? That is depletion of the natural resources. So if we continue to have a boom in tourism, at some point it will have environmental negative effects. Can you imagine that instead all property in Iceland was owned? All the natural resources in this country was owned. We just put a fence about everything. Then the owners of the natural resources would actually take care that you don't have overuses. We have said in Iceland we don't want that. For some, not economic, not rational views, but emotional views. It is our land and stuff like that. Fine. But how do we regulate it then? Well, when I will pay my hotel fee tomorrow morning, I'll be paying a little tax on that. That tax is essentially a substitute for a property right. So if we have too many tourists, we just have a very high tax, then we could regulate in that way. Now it's not really regulating anything because it's tiny. But you could think of it as a substitute for property rights. And that's, in my view, probably a good thing to have if you don't want to have fences around everywhere in Iceland, which would be my preferred solution essentially, because that's what we're doing in fishery, and it works in fishery. Then we need to have a fee that regulates the usage of natural resources. And that, in economic sense, also provides the best efficiencies. Then the fourth sense is really interesting. It's another Nobel Prize winner, Elin Åström. She died a couple of years ago. Actually, both Åström and Roland Coase died a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, both of them. She said that she's done a lot of work on how, in different society, the use of the commons is regulated by social norms. So instead of having property rights, we will tell each other, behave well. That works well in small groups. Imagine you are in an office and you have 5 people there. If there's some idiot who's always leaving his coffee cups somewhere, somebody will say, you have to clean that up. That is a social norm. The problem, if there are all these people in here, none of you will follow any social norms. Well, if you look at the Swedes and go anywhere there's served food, the Swedes will always line up very nicely. They are solving that problem with a queue. There's very social norms. If you see the Danes, they don't give a shit. They just get in, right? We start to eat pork. No fish, just pork. I have suggested that the Danish kroner should not be pegged to the euro, but to the price of bacon. But that we can take another time. But social norms can handle these issues, but on a grander scale, social norms cannot grant anything. And property rights is the best thing. A couple of months ago, I thought about that, and I hope you're all reading my column in Fredagblad every Wednesday. And if you don't, no, too bad for you guys. I was writing a piece about what I'm talking about now. And I think maybe there is a relationship between property rights and how well the environment is protected. So what I did was I found 2 indices. One of what is made by, called the Environmental Performance Index. Basically a think tank going out and measuring the quality of environment in a number of areas across the world. So every dot here is a country in the world. The International Property Rights Index is an index of the quality or the level of property rights protection. If you go to North Korea, there is no property rights protection. Government owns everything, or Kim Jong-un owns everything, including the nuclear arms. That's his. There is no protection of property rights. If we look at Iceland, Iceland scores very high on property rights protection and very high on the environmental standard. You can see there is a very strong correlation between the two. So there tend to be a correlation between those countries that take care of protecting property rights. They also have successful or good results in terms of the environment. I know that this will be disturbing for Björk, because she thinks that everything in Iceland is just owned by us, all of us. But we also know if everything is owned by all of us, nobody owns it. And therefore we don't take care of it. And that is the beauty of the Icelandic fishery quota system. Because each of you as fishermen don't care at all about the environment. Don't tell me anything else. You don't care. But there is a property right defined, and you just do your work to produce and fish, and then you trade your quotas. The outcome is, magically enough, that we have a good fish stock, that we have a sustainable fishery industry in Iceland, and I've had that for 30 years. At least 25 years. And we have that because we have well-defined property rights. And my suggestion is that we do that, think about every environmental issue we have in this country. We should think in terms of property rights rather than emotions and all of that. Look at where we have the result. We have the result from the quota system. And I know you all love the quota system in its present form. But if we go back when it was introduced, nobody liked it, with the exception of The Economist. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure. On behalf of all the economists, we did it. Of course, I didn't do anything. At that time, I was very busy getting drunk in university. But the protection of property rights is at the core of why this is working. But, and this I already said, there is an issue that economists don't know about. When you study economics and what we call microeconomics or price theory, we know about allocation. We know about what mechanism ensures the best usage, the most efficient usage of the production capacity. The fishery ship, the diesel, the labor you put in to do what you do. Economists can say nothing about income distribution. What is a fair income distribution? Economists have no view on that. At least not as economists. But if you follow the political debate in any topic, it is always about distribution, isn't it? I'm very sure that you all think that the allocation of fishery quotas now as they are in Iceland are completely fair. This is how it should be. Of course, there is that idiot over there who shouldn't have had it, but at least we are all in agreement in here that the allocation of fishery resources or quotas is completely fair in the starting point, going back to the beginning. However, I tell you, if you go to the closest bar here and say that to somebody, you might very well get beaten up. And this is the case basically in everything in Iceland. I have noticed now for 10 years that there is a feeling among Icelanders that I have been cheated. There is always the feeling in Iceland that somebody got all the money and I only had the debt in my house. Bloody currency and bloody mortgage system. Somebody stole all the money. The fishers, the bankers, whatever. And there is something to that. There is something to it because the first allocation, of course, has an impact. So if you don't like the distribution of income and wealth in society, you can tax somebody with wealth and transfer it to somebody who don't have wealth. Economists fully acknowledge that that can be a political decision. But what we also acknowledge as economists is when we do that, we want to do it in a way that it doesn't distort economic decisions. We want to reduce the negative impact of redistribution. Are you ready to get shocked? On a very, very large, significant part of my income, I pay 59% income tax in Denmark. There's a reason why the Danish economy hasn't been growing for 8 years. As a result, somebody would find it more fun not to work so much. I do it for some weird reason. But coming here, for example. But we have these distortion of that. So imagine that if we in Denmark had a natural resource that we couldn't tax, and then reduce the distortionary taxes, then that would be a good thing. And that, of course, is one of the arguments concerning the resource tax. And we pay the resource tax, but think about the resource tax as something that redistributes income because somebody claims that the initial allocation was not fair. I have no view whether it was fair or not. But that's just how it is. I don't think it's a stupid system. I think it's a pretty sane way to do it. If you want to do redistribution, you can do it in this way. But I would like to give some views on that. Something that you should not do with resource taxes. First of all, you should know what it is. It is redistribution from those who control the rent-creating mechanism, who essentially owns the quotas, to those who don't own the quotas. That's redistribution, and that's fine. But if you claim it is about redistribution, if everybody in Iceland have their share of the fish in the sea around the country. The argument should really be that we should not redistribute from the quota owners to government. No, we should redistribute it from quota owners to every single Icelander. In the extreme form of this, everybody in Iceland should get a check every month from you guys. That's the resource fee. That would make the connection completely clear. And the reason I'm saying this is that when things goes into public finances, they tend to be reflected in higher public spending rather than being redistributed to those who owns the resource. So I'm actually think that if we want to talk about this, we want to have a connection between the resource fees, and that goes for other sectors as well, that it essentially goes into people's own coffers in some way. I'm not arguing for changing the system, I'm just saying that we should, in our mindset about what it is. Another thing I would argue is that we have what economists call time inconsistency problems. Let's say that I tell somebody that there is no corporate taxation in Iceland tomorrow, or in Denmark tomorrow. That would be wonderful. Everybody starts to invest. They get a return on that investment. And then after you invested and the return is coming in, the government comes back and says, ha, I got you. There is now a corporate tax. We take it all. That is a time inconsistency problem. The inconsistency, what is optimal for the government when you announce it, and one will be optimal for the government once the decisions are being taken out in the economy. That is a problem with the resource fee as well. Because if it is so that you invest in the vessels and everything else, and you have a higher return, and then the government comes out and says, we changed the fee. If you know that, you will not make the investment to begin with. So that's another thing, is that if you need to do that, you find to have some mechanism by which government commits itself to not changing the fee, whether it's one or the other size, but there need to be no change of that. I think that's quite important. The other thing is that it should not be used as a fiscal mechanism. It shouldn't be so that because 1 year the economy is slower, the Minister of Finance says, I'll just get a little bit higher fee. Poor Bjarni Ben, I need some money, I'll just increase the fee this year. If you do that, you have the same problem. So you need to have some kind of mechanism. To me, it's really essentially about getting this whole setup outside of government. And the redistribution from the resource owners to the rest of the population should essentially go out without touching public finances. And that's essentially because I have no trust in politicians. And I'm sure I have 98% backing to that position in here. Now I can illustrate a problem of time. I am way over time. Isn't that correct, Khan? Now, on my presentation here. Do you know why I'm over time? Because there was no price on me going over time. If I had a property right saying you can only spend 25 minutes, and when you spend more than 25 minutes, you have to pay €1,000 for every minute, then maybe I had been a little bit more careful with my time. And now I say this was just something I said to inform you all. Should we have some questions from the floor? Can we do that? Oh, that was surprising. You're welcome to shout. Just don't throw anything at me. No questions? Lars Christensen, you arrived in Helsinki where no questions are being asked. That's the worst place to talk in the world. This would never happen. Nobody would have laughed afterwards. Like, that was a very good presentation. Would you like to drink vodka with me? Okay, then thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the meeting, and I'll see you for drinks. You're buying.